At our family reunion dinner, I watched my son's mother-in-law slip something into my drink when she thought no one was looking, her smile sweet as poison as she handed me the glass. The table buzzed with cheerful conversation, but something inside me shifted. 47 years of being the nice one, cracked like ice under pressure. Can you imagine discovering that someone you welcomed into your family with open arms was trying to humiliate you in front of everyone you love? What would you do if it were you? I smiled back at her and calmly set my glass down. But I already knew that in the next 10 minutes, my quiet act of switching our drinks would forever change how this family saw their beloved matriarch. But before I continue, take a quick look to make sure you're still subscribed. I don't want you to miss any of these eye-opening stories. My name is Juliette Kensington. I'm 67 years old, and until I retired 3 years ago, I spent 35 years as a high school English teacher. I raised my son David as a single mother after my husband passed when David was only 12. I worked double shifts, tutored students on weekends, and stretched every dollar to give him the education he deserved. When he married Rebecca 5 years ago, I welcomed her mother Patricia into our family with the same warmth I'd shown everyone. And now, sitting at this beautifully set dinner table in the mountain cabin we'd rented for our first extended family vacation, I watched her carefully dissolve what I was certain was a laxative tablet into my evening wine. The cabin smelled of pine and the roast chicken Rebecca had prepared with such care. Candles flickered on the rustic wooden table, casting warm shadows across 8 faces. My son David, his wife Rebecca, their twin boys aged 7, Rebecca's father Martin, her sister Jennifer with her husband Paul, and Patricia, who was now pushing my doctored glass closer to my place setting with theatrical concern. "Juliette, dear, you've barely touched your wine. Are you feeling well?" Her voice dripped with false sweetness, and I caught the barely concealed smirk she exchanged with Jennifer. But there was something else in that look, a confidence that made my stomach turn. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was planned. Patricia's fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm I'd seen before. The same nervous tell she had when she'd accidentally served me the one dessert I was allergic to at Rebecca's birthday party. When she'd mistakenly given me directions to the wrong church for David's award ceremony. When she'd forgotten to mention the dress code for their country club dinner, leaving me underdressed and mortified. The realization hit me like cold water. This had been happening for months, maybe years. Small humiliations I'd dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. Patricia wasn't just trying to embarrass me tonight. She was systematically trying to drive me away from my son's family. Her eyes met mine across the table, and in them I saw a calculation that chilled me to the bone. I reached for my wine glass, Patricia's satisfied smile growing wider, and in that moment made a choice that would shatter the careful peace I'd maintained for years. As Patricia turned to answer Martin's question about dessert, I smoothly switched our glasses, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration I hadn't felt since I was 7 years old and finally fought back against the neighborhood bully. What I was about to discover would make that dinner just the beginning of a nightmare that would destroy everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and how far someone will go to claim what they believe belongs to them. 10 minutes later, Patricia excused herself from the table with an urgency that sent ripples of barely contained laughter around the room. "Must be something I ate," she called weakly from the hallway, and I watched my son David bite his lip to keep from smiling while Rebecca patted her father's hand sympathetically. The twins giggled behind their napkins, and even Martin seemed to be fighting back amusement at his wife's sudden predicament. But I wasn't laughing. Sitting there, watching my family find humor in what they thought was Patricia's unfortunate digestive episode, I felt something cold settle in my chest. This moment of victory felt hollow, tainted by a nagging certainty that I'd only scratched the surface of something much darker. While the others cleared the table and moved to the living room, I lingered in the kitchen, ostensibly to help Rebecca with dishes, but really to process what had just happened. That's when I noticed Patricia's purse, sitting open on the counter where she'd left it in her rush. The same purse she'd been clutching protectively all evening, the same one she'd reached into just before doctoring my drink. I should have walked away. A decent person would have respected her privacy. But decent people don't slip laxatives into other people's drinks. And something about Patricia's confident cruelty had awakened a part of me I'd kept buried since childhood. The part that needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly. Inside her purse, beneath the usual clutter of tissues and mints, my fingers found a small plastic bottle with no label. The remaining tablets inside were identical to what I'd seen her dissolve in my wine. But that wasn't what made my blood freeze. Tucked beneath the bottle was a folded piece of paper, and when I opened it, I found a list written in Patricia's careful handwriting. Operation Remove Juliette was written at the top in neat cursive. Below it, a series of dates and planned humiliations. March 15th, seafood allergy accident at birthday dinner. April 3rd, wrong church directions for award ceremony. April 22nd, forget dress code for country club. May 10th, laxative in wine at cabin. Each entry had a small checkmark beside it except the last one. At the bottom of the page, in red ink, were the words, Final phase, July 4th weekend. Must complete before inheritance discussion. My hands shook as I read those words again. Inheritance discussion. What inheritance discussion? I heard footsteps approaching and quickly folded the paper, slipping it into my own purse just as Rebecca entered the kitchen with an armload of dessert plates. Mom, Patricia is finally feeling better, she said with a smile that seemed forced. She asked if you could bring her some of that herbal tea you mentioned earlier. She's in the master bedroom. The request felt like a trap, but I found myself nodding, preparing the tea with hands that trembled slightly. As I walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, I could hear Patricia's voice through the partially open door, and what I heard made me freeze in the shadows. Told you this would work, Martin. By July 4th, she'll be so embarrassed and uncomfortable that David will have to choose between his mother and family peace. And we both know which one he'll choose, especially once he learns about the will. Martin's voice was lower, harder to make out, but I caught enough. Dangerous game, Patricia. What if she finds out? The money. She won't find out. Patricia's voice was sharp with certainty. Juliette Kensington is exactly what she appears to be, a naive retired teacher who thinks everyone has good intentions. She'll never suspect that David's inheritance depends on us controlling the family dynamics. Richard made sure of that in his final arrangements. Richard. My deceased husband's name hit me like a physical blow. What final arrangements? What inheritance? David had never mentioned anything about money from his father's estate. I'd assumed, like everyone else, that Richard had left nothing but debts and heartache when he died. I stood frozen in that hallway, the teacup growing cold in my hands, as the foundation of everything I believed about my life began to crumble. Patricia wasn't just trying to humiliate me out of petty cruelty. She was systematically destroying my relationship with my son for money. Money that apparently came from my dead husband. Money I knew nothing about. And the most terrifying part was realizing that David, my beloved son, might already know about it all. The inheritance discussion scheduled for July 4th weekend was only 3 weeks away, and I was beginning to understand that I wasn't invited to participate. I was meant to be removed from the equation entirely, discredited and estranged, so that whatever Richard had left behind could be claimed without my interference. What I was about to uncover would prove that Patricia's list was just the beginning, and the real conspiracy reached deeper into my family than I could have imagined. I never delivered that tea. Instead, I slipped back to my room and spent the night staring at Patricia's list, my mind racing with questions that grew more disturbing with each passing hour. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have shocked the old Juliette Kensington. I was going to investigate my own husband's death and the inheritance no one had bothered to tell me existed. The next day, while the family enjoyed a hiking trip I'd begged off citing a headache, I drove to the nearest town and found the public library. What I discovered in those dusty records and online databases shattered every assumption I'd made about my marriage and my husband's death 15 years ago. Richard Kensington hadn't died penniless, as I'd believed. In fact, he'd been remarkably wealthy, with investments and properties I'd never known existed. More disturbing, his death certificate showed inconsistencies I'd never noticed. The attending physician's signature didn't match samples of his writing in medical journals, and the cause of death, listed as sudden heart failure, came without the autopsy that should have been mandatory for a 52-year-old man with no prior cardiac history. But the most shocking discovery came in a legal document dated just 3 months before Richard's death. He'd established a complex trust with very specific conditions. The primary inheritance would go to David, but only if he maintained family unity and demonstrated proper judgment in relationships. If David's mother, me, was deemed unfit or disruptive to family harmony by a panel of 3 designated family members, the inheritance would instead go to his spouse's family. The 3 panel members were listed as David himself, his future spouse, and that spouse's parent or guardian. I stared at those words until they burned into my memory. Patricia wasn't just trying to drive me away from my son. She was positioning herself to steal an inheritance worth nearly $2 million. And David, whether he knew it or not, was caught in the middle of a scheme that required my complete alienation from the family. As I tried to connect the dots, I got curious. Where are you listening to me from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I like to imagine these stories echoing in so many different places. The more I researched, the more pieces fell into place. Patricia's sudden friendship with David 5 years ago, her introduction of him to Rebecca at what I'd thought was a chance meeting, even Rebecca's swift pregnancy with twins. Everything had been orchestrated to create the perfect conditions for claiming Richard's money. I found evidence that Patricia had been investigating my family for years before Rebecca and David ever met, including hiring a private investigator to research Richard's financial situation. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I watched my family with new eyes. David's easy laughter with Martin, Rebecca's deferential behavior toward her mother, even the way the twins seemed more comfortable with their grandmother Patricia than with me. It all took on sinister new meaning. Had David known about the inheritance all along? Was my son complicit in a plan to destroy his relationship with his mother for money? That night, I made a mistake that could have cost me everything. Unable to contain my suspicions any longer, I confronted Patricia directly. I found her alone on the cabin's back deck, enjoying what she probably thought was her moment of victory. "I know about the list," I said quietly, stepping out of the shadows. Patricia's wine glass paused halfway to her lips, but her expression remained calm. "I'm sorry, Juliette. What list?" "The one in your purse. Operation Remove Juliette. Every humiliation planned and executed, every careful step to drive me away from my own son." For a long moment, Patricia studied me with the calculating look I'd seen at dinner. Then she smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen. "You went through my personal belongings. How disappointing, but not entirely surprising. You always were too curious for your own good. I also know about Richard's inheritance, the $2 million, the trust conditions." Patricia's smile widened. "Do you now? And what exactly do you think you know about your late husband's arrangements? I know that you need me declared unfit to claim the money. I know that David is being manipulated, possibly without even realizing it. And I know that you've been planning this for years." Patricia stood slowly, setting down her wine with deliberate care. "Juliette, dear, you've discovered exactly what I wanted you to discover. Did you really think it would be that easy to outsmart me? That I'd leave incriminating evidence where a nosy mother-in-law could find it?" The words hit me like ice water. The list, the purse left conveniently open, the overheard conversation. It had all been theater, designed to make me paranoid and desperate. But why? "You see," Patricia continued, her voice soft and deadly, "proving you're mentally unstable and paranoid is much easier when you actually behave in mentally unstable and paranoid ways. Going through my purse, making wild accusations, researching conspiracy theories about your husband's death. It all paints such a clear picture of a woman losing her grip on reality." I realized with growing horror that I'd walked directly into her trap. Every move I'd made to uncover the truth had been anticipated, manipulated, used against me. And tomorrow morning, Patricia would have everything she needed to convince my son that his mother was suffering from delusions and posed a threat to his family's stability. But what I discovered next would prove that Patricia had made one fatal error in her perfect plan. She'd underestimated just how far a desperate mother would go to protect her child, even from herself. The next morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. David knocked on my bedroom door before sunrise, his face grave in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. "Mom, we need to talk. Patricia told us about last night." I followed him to the living room where the entire family waited in a carefully arranged semicircle. Rebecca with tears in her eyes, Martin looking uncomfortable, Jennifer recording everything on her phone, and Patricia sitting regally in the center like a judge pronouncing sentence. Only the twins were absent, mercifully spared from witnessing their grandmother's public trial. "Patricia says you went through her purse and accused her of trying to poison you," David began, his voice gentle but firm. "She says you've been making paranoid claims about some conspiracy involving Dad's death and hidden money." I looked at my son, this boy I'd raised alone, sacrificed everything for, loved beyond measure, and saw doubt in his eyes. Not confusion or concern, but doubt about me, about my sanity, about whether his mother could be trusted. "David," I said carefully, "there are things about your father's death that don't add up. Financial records that show—" "Mom, stop." His voice was sharper now, and I saw him exchange a look with Rebecca. "We've been worried about you for months. The way you've been acting at family gatherings, the strange comments, the paranoia. Patricia showed us the medical articles she found in your internet history. Articles about dementia and paranoid delusions in elderly women." The room spun slightly. "What medical articles? I never searched for anything about dementia." Patricia leaned forward with false concern. "Juliette, dear, memory issues are often the first sign. You probably don't remember searching for those articles, just like you probably don't remember some of the concerning things you've said recently." "What things?" I demanded, but even as I asked, I could see in David's face that he believed them. Whatever Patricia had told him, whatever evidence she'd fabricated, it was working. Rebecca spoke for the first time, her voice breaking. "You told me last month that you didn't trust the twins' school, that you thought they were being brainwashed. You said you might need to rescue them from us." I stared at her in complete shock. "I never said anything like that." "Rebecca, you know I would never—" "And you called David at work 3 weeks ago, insisting that someone had broken into your house and moved all your furniture," Jennifer added, consulting notes on her phone. "When he went to check, everything was exactly where it had always been." The lies were so detailed, so perfectly crafted, that for a moment I wondered if I was losing my mind. Had I said those things? Made those calls? The doubt they were planting was so insidious that I began to question my own memories. But then David delivered the blow that shattered my heart completely. "Mom, we've been talking as a family, and we think it would be best if you got some professional help. We found a lovely memory care facility about an hour from your house. Very comfortable, excellent staff. You could move in next month, and we'd visit every weekend." Memory care facility. They wanted to put me in a nursing home, lock me away where I couldn't interfere with whatever they were planning. The inheritance discussion Patricia had mentioned suddenly made perfect sense. With me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized, David would have complete control of any family assets, guided by his loving in-laws who only wanted what was best for everyone. I looked around that circle of faces, people I'd welcomed into my life, cooked for, celebrated with, loved, and realized that only one person in that room was genuinely concerned about my welfare. Me. "David," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 12 and wanted to quit piano lessons because you thought you weren't good enough? I told you that quitters never discover what they're truly capable of. I made you promise to stick with it for 1 more month." His expression softened slightly. "Mom, what does that have to do with—" "You kept that promise, and 3 weeks later you played Chopin's Minute Waltz at the school recital. Perfectly. You cried afterward because you were so proud of yourself, and you told me you were sorry you'd ever wanted to quit." I could see the memory registering in his eyes, the moment of genuine connection breaking through Patricia's carefully constructed narrative. "I'm not quitting on you now, son. Not on us. And I'm not going quietly to any memory care facility while people who don't love you the way I do make decisions about your future." I stood up, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt completely calm. "I'll prove to you that I'm not losing my mind. But more importantly, I'm going to prove that the people you're trusting with my life are exactly the ones you should fear most." Patricia's mask slipped for just an instant, and I saw genuine worry flash across her face. She'd expected me to crumble, to accept their verdict, and disappear gracefully. She hadn't planned for the possibility that a cornered mother might become the most dangerous opponent she'd ever faced. What none of them knew was that I'd spent my last night in that cabin making copies of every document I'd found, uploading everything to a secure cloud account, and contacting a private investigator whose number I'd found in Richard's old papers. Someone my husband had apparently hired just weeks before his death. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Patricia's perfect plan was about to unravel in ways she never could have anticipated. I left that cabin within the hour, driving away while my son's family watched from the windows with expressions ranging from relief to genuine sadness. But I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to the address I'd found in Richard's papers, a small office above a diner in a town 40 miles away, where a private investigator named Marcus Webb had apparently been waiting 15 years for someone to ask the right question. Marcus Webb was nothing like the private investigators I'd seen in movies. He was 73 years old, walked with a cane, and operated out of an office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. But his eyes were sharp as laser beams when I mentioned Richard's name, and when I showed him the documents I'd copied, he leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. "Mrs. Kensington, your husband hired me 3 weeks before he died. He suspected his business partner was embezzling money and wanted proof before he confronted him. But what I found was much worse than theft." He pulled out a file cabinet that looked older than my son and withdrew a thick manila folder. Richard discovered that his partner, Martin Caldwell, wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically poisoning Richard with small doses of digitalis, a heart medication that's nearly undetectable in normal autopsy procedures. The plan was to cause gradual heart failure that would look natural. Martin Caldwell, Rebecca's father, Patricia's husband, the kind, quiet man who'd been sitting at that dinner table, watching his wife orchestrate my downfall while knowing he'd murdered my husband for money. Richard paid me to gather evidence, but he died before I could present it to him. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, and without family requesting further investigation, the case was closed. I kept the file active for years, hoping someone would eventually come asking questions. My hands shook as I opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Martin meeting with suspicious contacts, financial records showing the systematic theft of nearly $3 million from Richard's accounts, and most damning of all, a recording Richard had made of Martin confessing to a friend about solving the Richard problem permanently. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "I tried, Mrs. Kensington, but Martin Caldwell had connections. The chief of police was his golf buddy. The coroner owed him money from a bad real estate deal. And without family pushing for justice, it was easier for everyone to let sleeping dogs lie." But there was more. Webb had continued investigating after Richard's death, tracking Martin's movements and financial activities. What he'd discovered was a pattern spanning decades. Martin and Patricia had been running marriage scams, targeting wealthy older men and women, orchestrating chance meetings between their victims and attractive younger accomplices, then systematically draining their assets through manipulation, theft, and, when necessary, murder. Your son isn't their first target, Mrs. Kensington. Rebecca is their fourth daughter, each one adopted informally as a teenager, trained to seduce and marry wealthy targets, then extract everything possible before the family moves on to the next victim. I felt physically sick as the implications sank in. David wasn't just being used for money. He was married to a professional con artist who'd been trained from adolescence to manipulate and destroy families. And my grandchildren, those beautiful twin boys I adored, were being raised by people who viewed love as a business transaction and murder as an acceptable cost of doing business. There's something else, Webb continued, pulling out a more recent folder. I've been monitoring their activities since your husband's death, and they've accelerated their timeline recently. Martin was diagnosed with lung cancer 6 months ago. Terminal, maybe a year to live. They're rushing to complete this final score before he dies, which makes them more dangerous than ever. Desperate people take desperate risks. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and Webb gestured for me to answer while he activated a recording device. "Mom, where are you? We're worried sick. Patricia said you were acting erratically when you left, and we found some disturbing searches on the cabin's computer. More conspiracy theories about Dad's death, articles about hiring private investigators." My blood chilled. They were still ahead of me, still manipulating the narrative. David, I'm fine. I'm getting some answers about. Mom, please, come home. We love you, and we want to help you get better. But running away and making wild accusations isn't going to solve anything. I could hear voices in the background. Patricia coaching him, feeding him lines. David, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your wife's family is not who they claim to be. Your father didn't die of natural causes, and there's evidence. The line went dead. When I tried to call back, it went straight to voicemail. Within minutes, Rebecca was calling, then Martin, then Jennifer, all with the same message. I was having a breakdown. I needed professional help, and if I didn't come home voluntarily, they were prepared to have me committed involuntarily for my own safety. Webb watched me process this latest manipulation with the calm expression of someone who'd seen it all before. They're closing the trap, Mrs. Kensington. The involuntary commitment is their backup plan if the memory care facility doesn't work. Once you're declared mentally incompetent, they have clear sailing to claim your husband's inheritance and disappear with your son and grandchildren. But we have evidence now, I said desperately. Your files, the recordings, the financial records. Surely that's enough to... It's enough to prove your husband was murdered and that Martin and Patricia are career criminals. But it's not enough to save your son or grandchildren from them. For that, we need them to make a mistake, to reveal themselves in a way that can't be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a mentally unstable woman. He leaned forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Kensington, I'm going to ask something of you that goes against every decent instinct you have. I need you to play their game better than they do. I need you to become bait. The plan he outlined was terrifying in its simplicity. I would appear to surrender, agree to the memory care facility, and act the part of a defeated, confused old woman. Meanwhile, Webb would use his contacts to plant surveillance equipment in my son's house and monitor their communications. The goal was to catch them discussing their plans openly, confident that they'd won and I was no longer a threat. The moment they think you're safely out of the way, they'll start making arrangements to disappear with David and the children. That's when they'll slip up, when we'll get the evidence we need to expose them completely. As I drove home that evening, I realized that my quiet life as a retired English teacher was over forever. I was about to enter a world of deception and manipulation that would test every skill I'd ever learned and every principle I'd ever held. I was 57 years old, alone, and facing opponents who'd spent decades perfecting the art of destroying families. But I was also a mother whose child was in danger, and that made me more dangerous than Patricia and Martin could possibly imagine. They'd spent so long underestimating the nice people of the world that they'd forgotten a fundamental truth. There is nothing more ruthless than a mother fighting for her child's life. The war for my family was about to begin in earnest, and I intended to win, even if it meant becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be. 3 days after I agreed to enter the memory care facility, Webb's surveillance equipment captured a conversation that revealed the true scope of Patricia and Martin's operation, and it was far worse than either of us had imagined. I sat in Webb's office, listening to the crystal-clear recording of my son's kitchen, where Patricia and Martin were celebrating what they believed was their final victory over me. But their conversation revealed horrors that made Richard's murder seem like just the beginning of their crimes. 23 years, Patricia's voice crackled through the speakers. 23 years of building this family, and finally, we're ready for the grand finale. The Kensington job was supposed to be our retirement plan, Martin replied, his voice weaker than I remembered, the cancer taking its toll. But with the diagnosis, we need to accelerate everything. How long before the old woman is safely locked away? She's scheduled to enter Sunset Manor on Friday. Once she's there, David will sign the papers transferring power of attorney, and we'll have complete control of the inheritance. But that's just the beginning, Martin. The real money isn't in the trust fund. My blood turned to ice at her next words. David's life insurance policy is worth $5 million. Rebecca's been increasing the coverage every year since they married, and he's never questioned it. Poor David, such a trusting soul. He has no idea his wife's been slowly poisoning him with the same digitalis you used on his father. The room spun around me as the full horror sank in. They hadn't just murdered Richard and weren't just planning to steal his money. They were systematically murdering my entire family, one generation at a time. David was already being poisoned, slowly and carefully. His death planned to look like the same heart condition that had supposedly killed his father. How long does he have? Martin's voice held professional curiosity, as if they were discussing a gardening project rather than my son's murder. 6 months, maybe 8 if his constitution is stronger than Richard's was. Rebecca's been adding it to his morning coffee for 3 months now. He's already complaining of fatigue and chest pains, but the doctors can't find anything wrong. By the time his heart finally gives out, it'll be completely natural, just like his father. Webb paused the recording and looked at me with grim sympathy. Mrs. Kensington, there's more. This gets worse. How could it possibly get worse? But as he resumed the recording, I discovered that my worst nightmares were still too small to contain the truth. What about the twins? Martin asked. That's the beautiful part, Patricia responded with a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. Rebecca's been documenting David's declining mental health for months, the same way we documented his mother's supposed dementia. When he dies, she'll be a grieving widow who needs support raising traumatized children. She's already identified her next target, Thomas Ashworth, the pharmaceutical millionaire. He's been widowed for 2 years, and he's absolutely devoted to his grandson. The twins will help her get close to him? The twins will be the connection. Thomas's grandson is in their class at school. Rebecca's been cultivating that friendship for months. When she approaches Thomas for support as a fellow single parent, he'll see her as a kindred spirit. Within a year, she'll be the new Mrs. Ashworth, and those boys will have a new father figure who conveniently happens to be worth $50 million. My grandchildren. My beautiful, innocent grandchildren were being used as bait for the next victim in an endless cycle of murder and theft. And once Patricia and her network had drained Thomas Ashworth's fortune, what would happen to David's sons? Would they be discarded like broken toys, or worse, eliminated as loose ends who might someday remember too much? But the recording wasn't finished revealing its secrets. Jennifer's been asking about expanding the operation, Patricia continued. She thinks we should take on 2 families simultaneously. We've never done concurrent jobs, too risky. She's found the perfect targets. The Williams family in Denver. Old money, 3 generations living in the same compound, and they've got 2 unmarried sons in their 30s. Jennifer's already moved to Denver and enrolled her daughter in their country club's youth program. The scope of their operation was staggering. This wasn't just about my family. It was an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been destroying families for decades. How many other mothers had lost their children to these monsters? How many other families had been systematically murdered for money while the killers moved on to new identities and new victims? Webb stopped the recording and pulled out another file. I've been researching their history since you came to me, Mrs. Kensington. Patricia Morrison, Martin Caldwell, Rebecca Morrison, Jennifer Morrison. None of those are their real names. I've traced them back through at least 6 different identities over the past 25 years. He spread photographs across his desk. Crime scene photos, newspaper clippings, missing person reports. The Hendersons in Oregon disappeared in 1998 after selling their ranch to pay for their son's wedding. The Kowalskis in Minnesota died in a house fire in 2001, just weeks after their daughter-in-law increased their life insurance policies. The Martinez family in Texas, carbon monoxide poisoning in 2006 that killed everyone except the newest daughter-in-law, who inherited everything and moved away immediately after the funerals. Each photograph showed happy families, trusting people who'd welcomed strangers into their lives with open hearts, never suspecting that kindness could be weaponized against them. And in several of the wedding photos, I recognized faces, younger versions of Patricia, Martin, and Rebecca, wearing different names but the same predatory smiles. Mrs. Kensington, your family isn't their latest victim. You're their next victim in a pattern that goes back decades. And if we don't stop them now, David and your grandchildren will be just 3 more names on a very long list of people who trusted the wrong family. The weight of that knowledge should have crushed me. Instead, it filled me with a rage so pure and focused that I felt like I could burn down the world with my bare hands. These people hadn't just destroyed my family. They'd been destroying families for 25 years, leaving a trail of orphaned children and grieving relatives who never learned the truth about how their loved ones died. But their pattern also revealed their weakness. They'd been so successful for so long that they'd become arrogant, predictable. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I had something they didn't expect: complete knowledge of their plan and the evidence to prove it. The question was whether I could save my son before their poison finished what they'd started, and whether I was strong enough to become the kind of person who could destroy them as thoroughly as they'd destroyed so many others. That night, I made a decision that would have horrified the woman I'd been just a week ago. I was going to save my son by any means necessary, even if it meant becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of playing their game with the same ruthless precision they'd used to destroy so many families. Webb had given me a tiny recording device and a plan that required me to get close enough to Patricia and Martin to capture them confessing to Richard's murder. But first, I had to convince David that I was ready to surrender, ready to accept help, ready to disappear quietly into the memory care facility where I'd never be a problem again. I called him at 7 a.m, making my voice small and defeated. "David, sweetheart, I've been thinking about what everyone said at the cabin. Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need professional help." The relief in his voice was heartbreaking. "Mom, I'm so glad you called. We've all been so worried about you. I'd like to have dinner with the family tonight, to apologize properly and discuss the arrangements. Would that be okay?" Within an hour, Rebecca had called to invite me over, her voice warm with the satisfaction of complete victory. They thought they'd broken me, convinced me that my own perceptions couldn't be trusted, that the only path forward was surrender to their superior judgment. I spent that afternoon preparing for the most important performance of my life. I practiced looking confused, defeated, grateful for their guidance. I rehearsed apologies for my paranoid behavior and expressions of appreciation for their patience with my declining mental state. And I tested the recording device Webb had given me, making sure it would capture every word clearly. But underneath that performance, I was calculating. I'd studied their pattern now. I knew how they operated, how they manipulated situations to their advantage. Tonight I would turn their own techniques against them. I arrived at David's house carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of a woman who'd accepted defeat. Patricia greeted me with arms wide open, playing the role of magnanimous victor with Oscar-worthy conviction. "Juliette, dear, I'm so proud of you for reaching out. It takes real courage to admit when we need help." Dinner was a carefully orchestrated performance on all sides. I played my part perfectly, confused, apologetic, grateful for their intervention. I praised Rebecca's cooking, complimented Martin's stories about his business ventures, and thanked Patricia repeatedly for her patience and understanding. The twins were at a sleepover, spared from witnessing what Patricia probably thought would be my final surrender. David seemed genuinely relieved to see me acting normally again, and I could see him relaxing as the evening progressed, believing that his family crisis was finally resolved. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee, I made my first calculated move. "I brought that wine from Richard's collection," I said, opening the bottle I'd carried in. "I thought it would be appropriate to share it tonight, as a way of honoring his memory and acknowledging that it's time for me to let go of the past." Patricia's eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. Richard's wine collection had been valuable, and she was probably already calculating its worth as part of her eventual inheritance. What a thoughtful gesture, Juliette. Richard always had exquisite taste. I poured glasses for everyone, making sure Patricia and Martin received the portions I'd specially prepared. Not with poison, but with a mild sedative Webb had provided that would make them drowsy and less guarded with their words. It was a trick I'd learned from their own playbook. As the evening progressed and the drug began to take effect, their carefully maintained masks started to slip. Patricia began making comments that revealed too much knowledge of family finances, and Martin grew careless with details about Richard's final days that he shouldn't have known. "You know, Juliette," Patricia said, her words slightly slurred, "Richard was such a trusting man. Too trusting, really. He never saw threats coming until it was too late. That was my opening." "What do you mean by threats?" Martin chuckled, his inhibitions clearly lowered. "Your husband thought he was so clever, hiring that private investigator. But we knew about Webb from the beginning. Richard never realized how easy it was to stay 2 steps ahead of him." My heart pounded, but I kept my voice casual. "Richard hired a private investigator?" "Oh yes," Patricia leaned forward conspiratorially. He suspected Martin of embezzling from their business partnership. Poor Richard had no idea the real scope of what we were doing or how close he was to discovering everything. In that moment, alone with my family around me, I knew there was no turning back. But I found myself thinking, if you were in my shoes, would you have the courage to face it, or would you stay silent to survive? Write in the comments. I really want to know. The recording device was capturing everything. Their admissions about Richard's investigation, their knowledge of his murder, their casual discussion of crimes spanning decades. But I needed more. I needed them to confess to the current plan, to David's poisoning, to the systematic destruction they were planning. I've been having such strange dreams about Richard lately, I said carefully. Dreams where he's trying to tell me something important, but I can't quite understand what he's saying. Patricia and Martin exchanged a look that confirmed everything I'd feared. Dreams can be very revealing, Patricia said with false sympathy. Sometimes our subconscious knows things our conscious mind isn't ready to accept. Like what? Like the fact that some deaths aren't as natural as they appear, Martin said, his voice taking on a bragging tone that alcohol often brings out in criminals. Your husband's heart condition, for instance. Amazing how a little digitalis can mimic natural heart failure so perfectly. The confession hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Hearing them casually admit to murdering my husband in my son's living room while he sat just feet away was almost more than I could bear. But David was staring at Martin with growing alarm, and I realized that the sedative was affecting him too, making it harder for him to process what he was hearing. "What are you talking about?" he asked slowly. Patricia shot Martin a warning look, but the damage was done. "Nothing, sweetheart. Martin's just tired, talking nonsense." But I couldn't let this opportunity slip away. "No, I want to understand. Martin, what did you mean about Richard's heart condition not being natural?" And that's when Patricia made the mistake that would destroy her perfect plan. She underestimated a mother's willingness to sacrifice everything to save her child. Her next words would give me all the evidence I needed and seal the fate of everyone in that room. Patricia's mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. The sedative, combined with years of successfully manipulating situations to her advantage, made her reckless in a way that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. She leaned back in David's expensive leather chair, wineglass in hand, and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed she'd already won. "Oh, Juliette, you really want to know the truth? After all these years of playing the grieving widow, you want to understand what really happened to your precious Richard?" David was struggling to focus, the mild sedative making him sluggish, but I could see alarm beginning to register in his eyes. "Patricia, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your father was an obstacle, David. A very stubborn, very inconvenient obstacle to a much larger plan." She gestured grandly around the room, encompassing the house, the family, the life they'd built. "Do you think all of this happened by accident? Your meeting Rebecca at that charity gala? The whirlwind romance? The perfect job opportunity that brought you to the city? The house that happened to be available in exactly the neighborhood we wanted?" Martin tried to interrupt, some part of his drug-addled brain recognizing the danger, but Patricia was beyond stopping now. 25 years of careful manipulation, of playing roles and maintaining facades, were pouring out in a torrent of confession. "We orchestrated everything, darling boy. Every single moment of your relationship with Rebecca was planned, choreographed, designed to bring us to this exact moment. Your father's death was just the opening move in a very long game." I kept the recording device steady, my hands surprisingly calm despite the horror of what I was hearing. "How did you kill him, Patricia?" "Digitalis, over a period of 6 months. Martin would meet him for their weekly business lunches, slip a little into his coffee each time. Such a slow, gentle way to die. The heart just gradually weakens until one day it simply stops. Very peaceful, really. Much more humane than he deserved." David was struggling to stand now, his face pale with shock and the effects of the sedative. "You're saying you murdered my father?" "We liberated your family from a selfish man who would have wasted his fortune on charitable donations and left you with nothing," Patricia corrected, her tone suggesting she genuinely believed she'd done David a favor. Richard was planning to give away 90% of his wealth to various causes. Cancer research, education foundations, environmental groups, such a waste of perfectly good money. But the inheritance? David's voice was weak, confused. Ah, yes, the mysterious inheritance that dear Juliette discovered. Patricia turned to me with mock admiration. Very clever research, by the way. Yes, Richard did set up a trust, but not quite the way you understood it. The $2 million is real, but it was never meant to go to you, David. It was our finder's fee. The room went completely silent except for the sound of David's labored breathing. I realized with growing horror that his symptoms weren't entirely from the sedative. They were signs of digitalis poisoning, exactly like his father had experienced. Richard hired us, you see. Not directly, of course, but through a series of intermediaries. He wanted to test his family's loyalty, to see if his wife and son would remain devoted if they thought he was dying poor. He paid us handsomely to orchestrate scenarios that would reveal everyone's true character. Martin was nodding along, his inhibitions completely gone now. The man was paranoid about gold diggers and fortune hunters. Ironic, really, considering we were the biggest fortune hunters of all. But somewhere in the middle of our little experiment, we realized we didn't need to settle for a $2 million fee when we could have everything. Richard's death opened up so many more possibilities. I had to ask the question that was burning in my chest, even though I already knew the answer. And David? What have you been doing to David? Rebecca had been silent through most of this confession, but now she spoke for the first time, her voice clear and emotionless. The same thing we did to his father. Slow, steady doses of digitalis in his morning coffee, just enough to weaken his heart gradually, create symptoms that doctors can't quite diagnose. My son stared at his wife with an expression of complete devastation. This woman he'd loved, trusted, built a life with, had been slowly murdering him for months while raising their children and planning their future. Why? He whispered. Because dead husbands can't contest wills or ask uncomfortable questions when large amounts of money disappear, Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. And because Thomas Ashworth responds much better to tragic young widows than he does to married women. The casual way she discussed his death, as if he were already gone, as if his murder was just another item on her to-do list, sent a rage through me that I'd never experienced before. But I forced myself to remain calm, to keep recording, to gather every piece of evidence I could. What about the twins? I asked, my voice steady despite the fire burning in my chest. Oh, the boys are perfectly safe, Patricia assured me with nauseating maternal warmth. They're our most valuable assets. Those sweet faces will be exactly what Thomas needs to heal from his grief over his first wife's death. Children are such wonderful conversation starters. And after Thomas, well, that depends on how much he's worth and how long it takes to access everything. But the boys are young enough to adapt to new situations, new identities if necessary. Children are remarkably resilient. David made a sound that was part sob, part growl. You're talking about my children like they're tools. They are tools, David. Very effective ones. Just like you were a tool, and your mother was supposed to be a tool. The only difference is that the boys are young enough to be trained properly, to understand their role in the family business. The family business. The systematic destruction of families, the murder of parents and grandparents, the trafficking of children from one criminal enterprise to the next. And my beautiful grandchildren were being groomed to continue this cycle, to become the next generation of predators. But Patricia wasn't finished revealing the scope of their operation. The beauty of our system is that it's completely sustainable. Jennifer's daughter in Denver is already making contact with the Williams family. Rebecca's cousin in Seattle is courting a pharmaceutical heiress. We have operations in 6 states now, all connected, all supporting each other. A network, I said, finally understanding the full scope of what I was facing. A family business that's been running for over 30 years, Martin confirmed proudly. Patricia's father started it, targeting wealthy widows in the 1970s. We've simply expanded the model to include entire families. This wasn't just about my family, or even Patricia's immediate crimes. I was looking at a criminal organization that had been destroying lives for 3 decades, that had murdered dozens of people and stolen millions of dollars, that was training children to become the next generation of killers and thieves. The recording device in my pocket had captured every word, every confession, every detail of their operation. I had enough evidence to destroy them completely, to send them to prison for the rest of their lives, to rescue not just my family, but potentially dozens of other families they were currently targeting. But as I looked at my son, growing weaker by the minute from the poison his wife had been feeding him, I realized that all the evidence in the world wouldn't save him if I couldn't get him medical attention immediately. The digitalis had been building up in his system for months, and Patricia's casual timeline suggested he was much closer to death than any of us realized. David seemed to come to the same realization. "How long do I have?" he asked Rebecca directly. She checked her watch as if consulting a train schedule. "At current dosage levels, probably another 3 weeks, maybe 4 if you have your father's constitution." That's when something inside me snapped completely. The careful, polite, law-abiding woman I'd been for 67 years disappeared, replaced by someone capable of anything necessary to protect her child. I stood up slowly, and when I spoke, my voice was calm and deadly. "You made one very serious mistake, Patricia." "Oh? And what was that?" "You underestimated what a mother will do when her child's life is threatened." I reached into my purse, past the recording device, past the pepper spray Webb had given me for protection, and pulled out the gun I'd purchased that morning after listening to their recorded confessions. I'd never owned a weapon before, never imagined I could point one at another human being, but watching these monsters casually discuss my son's murder had changed something fundamental in my soul. "Juliette," Patricia said, her voice finally showing the first hint of uncertainty. "Put that down. You're not a violent person." "You're right. I wasn't a violent person. But you've spent the last week proving to everyone that I'm mentally unstable and dangerous. So when the police find your bodies, and I tell them you confessed to murdering my husband and poisoning my son, who do you think they're going to believe?" The room went silent, except for David's increasingly labored breathing, and the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to become someone I'd never imagined I could be, but knowing that it might be the only way to save my family and stop these monsters from destroying anyone else. What happened next would determine not just whether my son lived or died, but whether justice would finally come for the dozens of families these people had destroyed, and whether the cycle of murder and manipulation would end with them or continue to the next generation. The gun felt impossibly heavy in my hands, but my grip was steady as I faced down the 3 people who had systematically destroyed my family. Patricia's confident mask had finally cracked completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath, while Martin struggled to focus through the sedative haze, and Rebecca sat frozen with the cold realization that their perfect plan was unraveling. "Juliette, think about what you're doing," Patricia said, her voice taking on the manipulative tone she'd used so effectively for years. "You're not a killer. You're a retired English teacher, a grandmother. This isn't who you are." "You're right," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "This isn't who I was, but you've spent months convincing everyone that I'm dangerous, unstable, capable of violent delusions. You've created the perfect cover story for what I'm about to do." I could see David struggling to process everything through the fog of digitalis poisoning, his face gray with the realization that his wife had been slowly murdering him while planning their children's futures as criminal accessories. But there was something else in his eyes now, a spark of the boy I'd raised, the fighter I'd taught never to give up. "Mom," he said weakly, "call 911. Get me to a hospital. Let the police handle this." "The police?" Patricia laughed, though there was hysteria creeping into her voice. "David, darling, your mother went through my purse, made wild accusations about conspiracies, and now she's pointing a gun at your family. Do you really think anyone's going to believe her paranoid fantasies over our word?" "They'll believe this," I said, pulling out the recording device with my free hand. Every confession, every detail about Richard's murder, every plan for David's death and the twins' future. It's all here. The color drained completely from Patricia's face. "You recorded us? I learned from the best. You taught me that evidence can be manufactured, that perception is more important than truth, that the right story told convincingly enough can destroy anyone. Well, congratulations. I'm an excellent student. Martin was trying to stand now, the sedative making him clumsy and desperate. You don't understand what you're interfering with, Juliette. This operation is bigger than just us. There are people involved who won't tolerate this kind of exposure. You mean Jennifer in Denver? Or Rebecca's cousin in Seattle? Or the mysterious network that's been running this family business for 30 years? I kept the gun trained on Patricia while addressing Martin. I know about all of it. Every operation, every target family, every murder spanning 3 decades. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice cold and calculating even in defeat. Even if you have recordings, even if you expose everything, David will still die. The digitalis is already in his system, building up over months. By the time doctors figure out how to treat him, it'll be too late. The casual cruelty of using my son's impending death as a negotiating chip sent a surge of rage through me that I'd never experienced before. But instead of making me reckless, it made me focused with laser precision. That's where you made your second mistake, I said. You assumed I was working alone. As if summoned by my words, the front door burst open and Marcus Webb entered with 2 men I didn't recognize. One carrying a medical bag, the other with equipment that looked distinctly law enforcement. Dr. Harrison, my son needs immediate treatment for digitalis poisoning, I called, without taking my eyes off Patricia. These 3 have confessed to administering it over a period of months. The doctor moved quickly to David's side while the other man, who I now realized was probably FBI given the sophisticated recording equipment he was setting up, began documenting the scene. Webb approached me carefully, his weathered face calm and professional. Mrs. Kensington, you can lower the weapon now. We have everything we need. They're going to claim I'm mentally unstable, I said, still not moving the gun. That this is all the paranoid fantasy of a delusional old woman. Not with the evidence we've collected, the FBI agent said, introducing himself as Special Agent Morrison. We've been investigating this family for 2 years, following a trail of suspicious deaths and missing persons across 6 states. Your recordings and witness testimony are the final pieces we needed. Patricia made one last desperate attempt at manipulation. Agent Morrison, surely you can see that this poor woman has had some kind of breakdown. She's been exhibiting signs of dementia and paranoid behavior for months. We've been trying to help her get professional care. Agent Morrison smiled grimly and pulled out a tablet, showing Patricia a screen full of surveillance photos. We have documentation of your family's criminal activities going back 5 years, including photographs of Martin purchasing digitalis from underground sources, Rebecca researching Thomas Ashworth's financial situation, and Jennifer establishing false identities in Denver. More than that, Dr. Harrison called from where he was examining David. This young man shows classic signs of chronic digitalis poisoning. Blood work will confirm it, but the symptoms are textbook, exactly what we'd expect from months of systematic poisoning. The walls were closing in around them now, and I could see Patricia's mind racing, looking for any possible escape or advantage. That's when she played her final, most desperate card. The twins, she said with malicious satisfaction. Dear little Marcus and Matthew. They're not at a sleepover, Juliette. They're with associates of ours, somewhere very safe, somewhere you'll never find them. Release us now, destroy those recordings, and maybe we can arrange for their return. The threat to my grandchildren hit me like a physical blow, but instead of weakening my resolve, it crystallized something fundamental inside me. These people had murdered my husband, poisoned my son, and now they were threatening to disappear my grandchildren into their criminal network. Agent Morrison, I said calmly, how long have you been investigating this family? 2 years of active investigation, but we've been tracking connected crimes for over a decade. Then you know about the children, the other family's children who disappeared into their network. His expression grew grimmer. We've identified at least 12 children over the past 15 years who went missing in connection with suspicious deaths in their families. We believe most of them are still alive, being used in ongoing operations. Patricia's confession about the twins wasn't just a threat. It was evidence of child trafficking on a massive scale. My grandchildren weren't just in danger. They were about to become part of a system that had been stealing and exploiting children for over a decade. But Webb had one more surprise. Mrs. Kensington, the twins aren't with associates. They're safe with my partner at a secure location. We've been monitoring the family's communications for weeks. We knew about the fake sleepover, and intercepted them before they could be moved. The relief nearly brought me to my knees, but I forced myself to remain focused. Patricia's face had gone white with the realization that their final leverage was gone, that decades of careful planning and execution were crumbling around them. "It's over," I said, finally lowering the gun. 30 years of destroying families, murdering parents and grandparents, stealing children and money. All of it ends tonight. Agent Morrison moved quickly to arrest Patricia and Martin, while Rebecca sat in stunned silence as the scope of their defeat became clear. Dr. Harrison was already administering treatment to David, explaining that with proper medical intervention, the digitalis poisoning could be reversed if they'd caught it in time. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Patricia's wrists, she looked at me with pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've unleashed, Juliette. This network is bigger than you can imagine. There are operations you'll never find, children you'll never save, families we've destroyed that you'll never even know about." "Maybe," I acknowledged, "but it ends with you. And every child you've stolen, every family you've destroyed, every person you've murdered, they'll finally have justice." Webb approached me as the FBI agents led the 3 criminals away. "Mrs. Kensington, there's going to be a lengthy investigation, dozens of crime scenes to revisit, missing persons cases to reopen, children to locate and reunite with surviving family members. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at my son, already showing signs of improvement as the antidote began working, and thought about my grandchildren who would be returned safely home. Then I thought about all the other families these monsters had destroyed, all the other children who were still trapped in their network, all the other parents and grandparents who had died never knowing why their loved ones had turned against them. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes," I said. "This ends with them, but it doesn't end tonight. We're going to find every victim, rescue every child, and make sure that no other family goes through what we've been through." The quiet English teacher who had walked into that cabin a week ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, wiser, and absolutely committed to seeing justice done, no matter how long it took or how much it cost her personally. The war for my family was over. The war for all their victims was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my son's house, watching my grandchildren eat breakfast while David prepared for another day of physical therapy. The digitalis had been purged from his system within weeks, but the emotional and psychological recovery was taking much longer. Trust, once shattered so completely, doesn't rebuild overnight. The twins, Marcus and Matthew, had adapted with the remarkable resilience of children, though they still occasionally asked about Grandma Patricia and why she couldn't visit anymore. We decided to tell them an age-appropriate version of the truth, that Patricia and their mother had been sick in a way that made them dangerous, and that sometimes people we love can hurt us without us understanding why. Rebecca was serving life in prison without parole, along with Patricia and Martin. The trial had lasted 3 months and revealed horrors that made international headlines. The family business murders, as the media dubbed them, had claimed at least 47 victims across 30 years, with evidence suggesting the actual number was much higher. David was learning to be a single father while processing the fact that his marriage had been a lie from the very beginning. Every milestone in his relationship with Rebecca, their first meeting, their courtship, even the conception of the twins, had been orchestrated by criminals who saw him as nothing more than a source of money to be drained and discarded. "Mom," he said one morning, looking up from the financial documents spread across his kitchen table, "I don't know how to process all of this. The house, the investments, the life insurance policies Rebecca took out. It's like living in a museum of lies." I understood his struggle more than he knew. I'd spent months working with Agent Morrison and his team, helping to unravel the network's operations and locate missing children who'd been trafficked through their system. We'd found 18 children so far, ranging in age from 8 to 23, all of whom had been stolen from families that had been murdered or destroyed. The oldest victim we located was Sarah Williams, now 23, who'd been taken from her grandparents' home in Colorado when she was 7 years old. She'd been raised to believe her grandparents had died in an accident and that Patricia's network had rescued her. For 16 years, she'd been trained to seduce and manipulate wealthy targets, never knowing that her real family had spent decades searching for her. Reuniting Sarah with her surviving aunt was one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful moments of the entire investigation. But it also highlighted the scope of the damage. 16 years of stolen childhood, of believing lies about her identity, of being taught that love was a weapon and family was a business transaction. The children who'd been in the network longer often struggled the most with reintegration. They'd been systematically programmed to view relationships as opportunities for exploitation, to see kindness as weakness, to believe that survival required the destruction of others. Deprogramming that kind of conditioning was a process that would take years, possibly decades. But there were success stories too. Tommy Martinez, who'd been 12 when his family was murdered in that house fire in Texas, was now 27 and working as a counselor for other trafficking survivors. He'd maintained enough memory of his real family to question the lies he'd been told, and his testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against several network members. The investigation had expanded far beyond what any of us had originally imagined. The FBI had established a task force spanning 12 states, following trails of suspicious deaths, missing persons, and financial crimes that stretched back to the 1970s. Patricia's confession about her father starting the operation had led them to unsolved cases that predated Richard's murder by decades. Jennifer Morrison, who'd been operating in Denver, had been arrested while attempting to poison her latest target, a wealthy widower whose trust she'd been cultivating for 8 months. The Williams family in Denver had been completely unaware that they were being systematically infiltrated and marked for destruction. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was how many other networks were operating similar schemes. Patricia's organization wasn't unique. It was part of a larger underground economy that traded in stolen identities, trafficked children, and the systematic destruction of wealthy families. The FBI estimated that there were at least 6 other major networks operating across North America, with international connections that reached into Europe and Asia. "Sometimes I wonder if we would have been better off never knowing," David said one afternoon as we watched the twins play in the backyard that had once been the site of so many family gatherings orchestrated by their mother for criminal purposes. "Do you really believe that?" I asked, though I understood the sentiment. Ignorance had been simpler, if ultimately deadly. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "No, I'd rather live with the truth than die from the lies. But it's hard, Mom. Every memory I have of my marriage is contaminated now. Every sweet moment, every tender gesture, every time Rebecca said she loved me. It was all part of an elaborate plan to kill me and steal my children." The psychological impact on David was something that worried me more than his physical recovery had. He'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in victims of long-term manipulation. But trust issues don't resolve quickly when you've discovered that your spouse was systematically murdering you while planning your children's futures as criminal accomplices. The twins were in therapy too, working with specialists who understood the unique trauma of children who'd been raised by people planning to exploit them. Marcus had started having nightmares about strangers trying to take him away, while Matthew had become almost obsessively protective of family routines and suspicious of any changes. But there were signs of healing. David had started dating again, carefully, with extensive background checks that had become standard procedure for anyone entering our family's life. The boys were excelling in school and had made friends whose families we'd thoroughly investigated. We'd learned to live with a level of vigilance that would have seemed paranoid before, but now felt like basic survival. My own transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The quiet, trusting English teacher was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more watchful, but also more purposeful than I'd ever been. I'd become a victim's advocate, working with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate suspected family targeting networks. The skills I'd developed in uncovering Patricia's operation had proven transferable to other cases. I could spot the patterns now, the too perfect coincidences, the systematic isolation of targets from their support systems, the gradual introduction of financial dependence and manipulation. I'd testified before Congress about the need for better coordination between agencies investigating these types of crimes. I'd written a book about recognizing and surviving family-targeted criminal networks, with all proceeds going to support services for trafficking survivors. I'd consulted on cases across the country, helping other families who'd discovered similar patterns of manipulation and exploitation. But the work was emotionally exhausting. Every case brought back memories of my own family's near destruction, and every rescued child reminded me of how close we'd come to losing David and the twins to a system designed to consume families whole. There were also frustrations. Despite all our efforts, we knew there were other networks still operating, other families being targeted, other children being groomed for exploitation. The criminals we'd captured represented only a fraction of the larger problem, and new operations seemed to emerge as quickly as old ones were dismantled. Agent Morrison had become a close friend through our ongoing work together, and he often reminded me that systemic change was measured in decades, not months. "Mrs. Kensington," he'd say during our regular case reviews, "you've saved more lives in the past 6 months than most people save in a lifetime. That has to be enough for today." But it was hard to feel satisfied when I knew how many victims we still hadn't found, how many families were currently being infiltrated without knowing it, how many children were being raised to become the next generation of predators. The financial recovery had been complex too. Richard's original inheritance was returned to David, along with assets that had been stolen from other victim families over the years. The house that Rebecca had chosen, the neighborhood that had been selected for its proximity to wealthy targets, the lifestyle that had been funded by blood money, all of it had to be evaluated and in many cases liquidated to provide restitution to other victims' families. David had decided to keep the house, but we'd completely redecorated it, removing every trace of Rebecca's influence and Patricia's manipulation. It was still the same structure, but it felt entirely different, cleaner, lighter, more genuinely ours. One evening, as I was helping the twins with homework at the kitchen table where I'd once confronted their murderous family, Marcus looked up at me with those serious 8-year-old eyes and asked, "Grandma Juliette, are we safe now?" It was the question I asked myself every day, and I'd learned that the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "We're safer than we were," I told him honestly. "We know things now that we didn't know before, and we have people watching out for us who didn't used to be there. But there might be other bad people? There might be. That's why we're careful about who we trust and why we pay attention to things that don't feel right. But Marcus, the most important thing is that we're together, and we're never going to let anyone separate us again." Matthew, who'd been listening while pretending to focus on his math worksheet, looked up and added, "And Grandma Juliette knows how to stop bad people now." He wasn't wrong. The gun I'd pointed at Patricia 6 months ago was now locked in a safe in my bedroom, and I'd become proficient in its use. The martial arts classes I'd started taking at 67 were progressing better than I'd expected. The security system I'd installed in both my house and David's was state-of-the-art. But more than that, I'd developed instincts I'd never had before. The ability to spot manipulation, to recognize when someone's story didn't add up, to trust my intuition when something felt wrong. I'd learned that being too trusting wasn't a virtue when it made you vulnerable to people who viewed kindness as weakness to be exploited. As I tucked the boys into bed that night, I found an envelope on my dresser that hadn't been there earlier. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me at the grocery store that morning, taken from across the parking lot with a telephoto lens. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were the words, "Some networks run deeper than you know. Some family trees have roots you'll never find." I sat on my bed, holding that photograph, and realized that our story wasn't over. Patricia, Martin, and Rebecca were in prison, but their network had been larger and more complex than we'd fully understood. Somewhere out there, people connected to their operation were still free, still operational, and apparently still interested in my family. The smart thing would be to call Agent Morrison immediately, to turn the photograph over to law enforcement and let professionals handle whatever threat this represented. And I would do that, first thing in the morning. But I also knew that if someone was targeting my family again, they would discover that the woman they were dealing with was no longer the naive English teacher who'd walked blindly into Patricia's trap. I was someone who'd learned from the best criminals how to think like a criminal, who'd developed networks within law enforcement and victim advocacy organizations, who'd proven capable of whatever was necessary to protect the people I loved. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share it with someone special who needs to hear what I lived through. This is a space of love and respect, And every day there's a different story of strong, courageous women who never gave up. Whoever had left that photograph would soon learn that some grandmothers, once awakened to the reality of evil in the world, become more dangerous than any criminal who underestimates them. The quiet life I'd once known was gone forever, but in its place was something harder and more purposeful. A woman who'd found her true calling in protecting families from the monsters who prey on love and trust. The war wasn't over, it was just entering a new phase, and this time I was ready.